Just after 3 in the morning, on the last day of August 1997, in a silent corridor at Balmoral, the man who would one day be king set down a telephone that had just told him Princess Diana was dead, put a hand flat against the wall, and stood there, not moving, for a length of time that frightened everyone who saw it. If the untold stories behind the House of Windsor are worth your time, subscribing costs nothing, and more like this one are already queued, the bell means you will actually see them. Hold that image, the receiver down, the hand on the wall, because the palace spent years making sure you never saw it. Go back to that corridor. The castle was asleep. Balmoral in late summer is a big, quiet house full of long carpeted hallways and closed doors, and at that hour there was almost no one awake. A few members of the household staff, the night duty, the people who cleaned the rooms and carried the trays. They were the only witnesses to what came next, and what they describe does not match the official account the world was given. The call came from Paris. According to staff who were in the castle that night, Charles took it standing up in the corridor near a side table where the telephone sat. There was a car crash in a tunnel by the Seine. There had been hours of confusion before that, the kind of night where news arrives in pieces and each piece is worse than the last. And then, just after 3, the last piece, she was gone. Here is what the staff say did not happen. He did not shout. He did not collapse into loud weeping. There was no scene of the kind you might picture. Instead, there was something quieter, and to the people watching, far more unsettling. He set the receiver back down. He put one hand against the wall, and he stood there, unmoving, for long enough that the silence itself became the thing everyone in that corridor remembered. Think about how strange that is to witness. You expect noise from grief. You brace for it. What these staff members got instead was stillness, a man simply leaning his weight into the wall of a Scottish castle as if the floor had shifted under him. One household account describes it as the moment the composed mask slipped, the mask everyone in that family is trained to wear, and behind it, for those first raw minutes, there was just a man who had been told the mother of his children was dead, and upstairs, asleep, were the children. That is the weight of it. 2 boys were in their beds in that same castle. William, 15. Harry, 12. They did not know yet. They were asleep the ordinary way boys are asleep on a summer holiday, and somewhere below them their father was standing against a wall, holding the worst news in the world, knowing that in a few hours he would have to climb those stairs, open those doors, and take their mother away from them with a sentence. Ask yourself what you would do next. 2 sleeping boys upstairs. The worst news in the world in your hand. When do you wake them? How do you say it? What do you let them have first? 1 more hour of not knowing, or the truth the moment they open their eyes? There is no protocol for that. There is no palace training for that. There is only a father in a corridor deciding. We will come back to how he made that choice, and it is not what you would guess. But first, you need to understand why that corridor matters at all, and why what the staff saw there was never supposed to reach you. Because there are 2 versions of this night. There always are, with this family. That is the whole story of the Windsors, really. The distance between the version you were shown and the version that was true. The official version gave the world a prince who managed a crisis, calm, capable, a senior royal absorbing terrible news and immediately turning to duty, to arrangements, to the machinery of what had to be done. That is the image the institution wanted, and for the most part, that is the image it delivered. In public, in the days that followed, Charles wore that composure almost flawlessly. He had been trained to since he was a boy. The private version is the one the staff carry, a man who, for a few unguarded minutes in an empty corridor, did not manage anything at all, who simply stood and let the weight of it land on him. Both of these are true. That is the uncomfortable part. He did break, and he did recover, and he did carry out every duty the day demanded. The gap between those two things, the broken man and the composed prince, is exactly what this story lives inside. To feel that gap, you have to understand what stood between these two people, because Charles and Diana were not a simple couple, and this was not a simple loss. They had married in 1981 before 750 million viewers. Sit with that number for a second, 750 million. It was, at the time, the most watched event in the history of television, a wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral, a young woman in an enormous ivory dress, a balcony kiss, a fairy tale sold to the entire planet in a single afternoon. The world was told this was a love story. Much of the world believed it. It was not, or at least not for long. The marriage strained, then cracked, then failed in full public view. They separated in 1992. 4 more years of a slow, painful, very public unravelling followed. The interviews, the accusations, the leaked tapes, the two households briefing against each other. And then the divorce was finalised in August 1996. August 1996. Read that date again, and then look at the date of her death. She died at the very end of August 1997. 1 year, almost to the day, after the marriage was legally ended. The paperwork that separated them was barely 12 months old when the telephone rang in that corridor. So when Charles took that call, he was not, on paper, her husband anymore. He was her former husband. And that fact matters enormously to what happened next, because it is the fact the institution would hide behind. A divorced man. The argument would go, what exactly is his role now? What does protocol even require of him? And here is where the public story and the staff story pull apart hardest. The public story of Charles by 1997 was a story of coldness. He was the villain of the fairy tale. He was the husband who had wounded her, who had never really been hers, whose heart had been elsewhere the whole time. Millions of people had decided, and not without cause, that this was a man who did not love her and perhaps never had. That was the image. The cold prince. Staff who served both households tell something more complicated, not a defence exactly. They do not paint him as innocent. He had wounded her deeply, and the people closest to both of them knew it, and did not pretend otherwise. But a man can wound someone, and still be gutted by their death. Those two things live together more often than we like to admit. The staff describe a man who understood, standing in that corridor, that whatever had gone wrong between them, the mother of his sons, was gone, and that this loss was now his to carry into 2 bedrooms upstairs. That is the thing the coldness story cannot hold. The cold prince of the public imagination does not press his hand to a wall and stand frozen in the dark. He makes the calls, files the feeling away, moves on. What the staff saw was not that man. What they saw was someone the official version had no room for. And all of it, every complication, came down to the same unbearable practical question. The boys, how and when to wake them. Because underneath the crowns and the protocol and the centuries of institution, this was, at 3 a.m, the most ordinary human dread there is. A parent who has to tell a child that the other parent is never coming back. Strip away everything royal about it, and that is what was left. The role could not help him here. There is no ceremony for it, no equerry who can do it for you, no line in any palace handbook. He had to be the one. He had to choose the words. He had to watch their faces. William was 15, old enough to understand everything at once, to feel the full shape of it land. Harry was 12, still a boy, still young enough that the world had not yet asked anything hard of him. And their father stood downstairs knowing that in a matter of hours he would divide their whole lives into before and after, with a few sentences, and that there was no way to soften it and no way to delay it forever. How he handled those first hours with his sons, what he decided to shield them from and what he could not, is one of the most revealing parts of this entire story. We will get to it. Keep the two boys in mind, asleep behind those closed doors, because everything Charles does over the coming week only makes sense once you see it as a father trying to protect them. But before the boys, before the Moores, before any of it, there was a first decision, and it was made fast in those same early hours, while the shock was still fresh and the household was still half in darkness. Diana was in Paris. Her body was in Paris. Someone had to bring her home. And in the machinery of the Crown, with a divorce barely a year old, that was not a simple or obvious matter. There were questions of protocol, questions of who she was now, officially, to this family, questions of what a former husband was entitled to do and what the institution would allow him to do. Charles, the staff and aides say, did not wait for those questions to be answered comfortably. Somewhere in those pre-dawn hours, standing in the ruins of that corridor moment, he made up his mind. He would not delegate it. He would not let the institution handle it at arm's length, tidily, the way the institution preferred to handle inconvenient things. And the instinct behind that decision tells you more about the private man than any official statement ever would. The Crown's instinct always is to manage, to arrange, to keep the messy human parts behind the walls where no camera finds them. His instinct in this first hour was different. His instinct was to go to her himself, which brought him almost immediately into conflict with his own house, because within hours, against resistance from inside the institution that questioned the protocol given the divorce, that asked whether a former husband should be the one to do this at all, Charles resolved to do the one thing the Crown did not want him to do. He would fly to Paris himself, he would bring Diana's body home, and he would do it whether the institution liked it or not. The resistance came from inside his own house. Aides questioned whether a divorced husband should fly to Paris to collect the body at all, whether protocol even allowed it. There were people around him who argued quietly and firmly that this was no longer his role, that the marriage had ended a year before, that the machinery had procedures for exactly this, and none of them required the man himself on a plane before dawn. Charles went anyway. He flew to Paris himself to bring Diana's body home. According to those who arranged it, he did not soften the decision into a request. He made it and expected it done. An aircraft was readied. In the small hours of the last day of August, 1997, he boarded, and the plane lifted off into a sky that was still dark, carrying him toward the city where the mother of his sons had died a few hours earlier. Think about what that meant for a man raised the way he was raised. Every instinct the Crown had drilled into him said stay. Stay composed. Stay at Balmoral. Let others handle the logistics of death. And every one of those instincts that morning, he overruled. At the hospital, staff describe him standing alone beside her for several minutes. The door was closed. No aides, no photographers, no witnesses inside the room. Just Charles and the woman he had married before 750 million people, 16 years before, in another life entirely. Picture that closed hospital door in Paris. Everything the Crown wanted controlled was happening on the other side of it, with no one watching but him. the whole apparatus of the monarchy, an institution built over 1,000 years to manage exactly this kind of moment, and it could not follow him through that door. For those few minutes, there was no protocol, there was no palace. There was only a man in a room with the dead. A former member of the household later said he emerged from that room changed, quieter, older. The word one of them used was that he seemed to have aged in those minutes, as though something had been added to him that would not lift again. He came out, and the machinery was waiting, and he stepped back into it, and it closed around him. And here is where the story starts to pull in two directions at once, because the moment he walked out of that hospital room, the training took over again. The composure reasserted itself. The face he had been taught to wear since he was a small boy slid back into place, and by the time the aircraft touched down again on home soil, the man the world would see was once more the man the world expected. Contained. Correct. Managing. That is the thing about the mask he had been given. It was not a lie exactly. It was a discipline. Royal composure is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling filed away somewhere, no camera can reach it, and Charles had been filing his away since before he could remember doing it. What happened behind the closed door in Paris stayed behind the closed door. What the public got was the surface. He brought her home. And then the family went to ground. They remained at Balmoral for a week. The whole of the royal family gathered in a Scottish castle 500 miles from London, in a silence that grew stranger with every passing day. No statement of the kind the public wanted, no appearance, no visible grief. From the outside it looked like the family had simply vanished at the exact moment the nation needed to see them. And the nation was not staying quiet. Something was happening outside the London palaces that no one at the top had planned for, and no one seemed able to stop. The crowds began to gather within hours, and they kept coming. By the middle of that week, the flowers outside Kensington Palace were not a carpet. They were a tide. People laid bouquets until the bouquets reached the height of a man's waist, then his chest. And still they came, tens of thousands of them, stretching back across the grass in every direction. Cards, candles, photographs, strangers weeping in the open, in a country that prided itself on never doing that. And they looked up at Buckingham Palace, and they saw the thing that would come to define the whole week. The flag over Buckingham Palace stayed conspicuously furled. The flagpole above the palace was bare, empty, and to a grieving public that made no sense at all, because in their minds a death meant a flag at half-mast, and the absence of any flag looked like the absence of any sorrow. What almost none of them understood, standing in that sea of flowers looking up at that empty pole, was the reason for it. The bare flagpole was not a decision to snub Diana. It was protocol, cold and ancient and utterly tone-deaf to the moment. The only flag ever flown above Buckingham Palace was the royal standard, and the royal standard flies only when the sovereign is in residence, and it never, under any circumstances, flies at half-mast, because the monarchy does not die. The Queen was at Balmoral, so the pole was empty. That was the rule, and the rule was centuries old, and it had never once anticipated a week like this one. But a rule is not what the crowd saw. The crowd saw a family that would not lower a flag for the most loved woman in the country, and the newspapers, sensing the mood, began to turn. The nation was reading a furled flag as coldness. Behind the walls, the truth was almost the exact opposite, because while the public was staring up at that bare flagpole and reading indifference into it, staff inside Balmoral describe a scene the cameras never got anywhere near. Charles was not hiding from grief. He was standing between his sons and the entire crushing weight of it. William was 15. Harry was 12. Their mother was dead, and every television channel in the country was broadcasting it on a loop, and every newspaper on every doorstep carried her face and the word gone, and the discussion of how she had died, and the photographs, and the speculation. For two boys who had just lost their mother, the outside world had become an unrelenting machine, repeating the worst thing that had ever happened to them, hour after hour after hour. And according to household staff, Charles set himself against that machine. He kept the televisions off, he kept the newspapers away from them. Inside the castle, he built a small perimeter of ordinariness around his sons and defended it. Aides recall that the instruction was clear. The boys were not to be exposed to the coverage, not the footage, not the front pages, not the endless analysis of their mother's last hours by people who had never met her. And then, instead of coverage, he gave them the moors. Staff describe him walking them on the moors, out across the open Scottish hills, the three of them, away from the phones and the screens and the swelling crowds hundreds of miles south. Just a father and two boys, walking through the heather in the grey northern light, saying whatever needed saying, or saying nothing at all. There is a photograph, the world would later see, of the family attending church that Sunday, composed and upright. There is no photograph of the walks. Those were not for us. And that is the gap, laid bare in a single week. Because what the institution wanted and what the man wanted had come apart completely. And everyone inside those walls could feel it. The institution's instinct was to hide, to pull the family behind the castle walls, to say nothing, to let the ancient rules run their course, to wait for the noise to die down, as it always had before, because the monarchy had survived every storm by refusing to be moved by any of them. Composure, continuity, silence. His instinct, witnesses say, was to protect, not the crown, his two children. And those are not the same thing. And for one terrible week in September, they pulled in opposite directions, and Charles stood at the exact point where they tore. Because protecting William and Harry meant keeping them at Balmoral, away from the cameras, in the only place that still felt like a refuge. But the longer the family stayed at Balmoral, the angrier the public became, and the angrier the public became, the louder the press grew, and the whole thing began to feed on itself. By the end of that week, the mood outside had curdled into something close to fury. The front pages stopped grieving and started demanding, "Where is the Queen? Show us you care. Speak to us." The papers that had once hounded Diana in life now appointed themselves the guardians of her memory, and they turned the full weight of that on the silent family in Scotland. One headline asked where the royal family was. Another told them to come home. The tone had shifted from mourning to accusation, and it was rising by the day. And you can feel the box closing. On one side, two grieving boys who needed their father, and quiet and open hills. On the other, a nation that had decided the family's silence was an insult, and a press amplifying that decision into a crisis for the monarchy itself. Something was going to have to give. The family was going to have to leave the moors, come south, stand in front of the crowds and the flowers and the bare flagpole, and perform the grief the public was demanding to see. Whether they would, and how, and what it would cost the man who had spent that week trying to give his sons a few ordinary hours before the world required a performance, was the question hanging over everything as September went on. Before we get to how that broke, one small thing. If these accounts of the family behind the image are worth your time, subscribing costs nothing, and more stories like this one are already queued. The bell is the part that matters. It means you actually see them when they arrive, instead of the algorithm quietly deciding you shouldn't. Then back to the corridor, because that is where all of this has been heading. Because here is what you have to hold on to through all of it. Through the defiant flight to Paris, through the closed hospital door, through the empty flagpole and the tide of flowers and the fury in the newspapers and the walks across the heather. Through all of it, in public, Charles held. The mask never once slipped where a camera could see it. When the family finally did come south, when they finally did face the crowds, the face he wore was the trained face, the correct face, the composed and dutiful prince absorbing a national catastrophe with exactly the restraint the Crown had spent his entire life installing in him. And that restraint was real, and it was total, and it was, in its way, a kind of achievement. To feel what he had felt in that Paris room and show the country nothing. That is what the monarchy asks. That is the discipline. The Crown had trained him since boyhood to file private feeling away where no camera could find it, and for years afterward he wore that discipline flawlessly in public. He would wear it at the funeral, walking behind his ex-wife's coffin with his sons. He would wear it in the decades after, through every public appearance, every interview, every anniversary, the composure holding, the surface smooth, the grief filed away exactly where he had been taught to file it. But there was one place where the training had already failed him completely. One night, before the plane, before Paris, before the flowers and the flag and the moors, one corridor, in the dark, in the first raw minutes after the telephone delivered the news. And there was one set of witnesses who were awake to see it happen, standing where they were not really meant to be, watching a man they served set down a receiver and press a hand flat against the wall and stop being a prince for a length of time that frightened them. What they saw in that corridor was never meant to reach us. It was never described in any official account. It was the one moment the Crown could not manage, could not file away, could not control, because it happened before the training could catch it, in front of the only people the palace never thinks to worry about. So go back there, back to the corridor at Balmoral, just after 3 a.m. on the last day of August, 1997. The receiver has just delivered the news from Paris, and the man who would one day be king does not shout. He does not fall to his knees. According to household staff who were awake in the castle that night, he simply sets the telephone down, presses a hand flat against the wall, and stands there, unmoving, for a length of time that unsettles everyone who sees it. That is the whole story, compressed into a single frame, a hand on a wall, a phone put down without a word, and a silence so long that the people carrying trays past the doorway did not know whether to keep walking or stop and reach for him. For years the world was handed a different picture, a prince who managed a crisis, a composed figure who did the right things in the right order. But the people who were actually there, the ones close enough to hear the receiver click into its cradle, described something the official account never once mentioned. Not a statement, not a decision, just a man leaning against plaster in a dim hallway, letting the weight of it land on him alone. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to understand what it cost him to let it happen at all. Because the Crown teaches its members one rule above all the others. Composure is duty. Feeling is private, and private feeling gets filed away somewhere. No camera will ever find it. You do not weep where you can be seen. You do not let the face move. Grief, in the House of Windsor, is something you perform in the correct measure at the correct time, and never something that simply overtakes you in a corridor at 3 a.m. Charles had been learning that rule his entire life. Think of the boy in the formal photographs, stiff collar, hands at his sides, sent away to school while his mother travelled the Commonwealth. He was raised inside an institution that prized the still face above almost everything. Emotion was a liability. Control was the job. By the time he was a grown man, the discipline was not a costume he put on. It had become the way he stood in a room, and here is the proof of how deep it went. In the days and years that followed, he wore that mask flawlessly. Watch him at the funeral procession that September. The whole world was watching. He walked behind his former wife's coffin through streets packed with weeping strangers, cameras trained on every muscle of his face, and his face did not break, not once. He was composed, expressionless in the way the training demanded. Beside him walked his two sons, William and Harry, 15 and 12, following their mother's cortege in front of a global audience, and their father held himself upright and steady the entire way. That public steadiness is exactly what makes the corridor so extraordinary. The man who could hold his face together in front of 1 billion mourners was the same man who, 6 days earlier, could not hold it together in an empty hallway, with only the staff to see. The mask worked everywhere the world could look. It failed him in the one place the world could not. That is the gap this whole story lives inside. In public, the trained composure. In private, for a few unguarded minutes, the training simply gave way. And the only witnesses were the staff who cleaned the rooms and carried the trays. The people the institution never thinks to count, awake in a castle in the small hours, watching a future king forget for a moment that anyone could see him. This is the moment you click to see. So watch what the training could not hold back. Not a performance of grief, the real thing, arriving before he had time to arrange his face for it, because grief that is scheduled is one thing. Charles could do that. He could stand at a lectern, read the words, lower the flag at the correct hour. What he could not do in that corridor was stop the news from hitting him faster than his discipline could rise to meet it. The phone gave him no warning. There was no protocol for the split second between hearing the words and remembering who he was supposed to be. And in that split second, the staff say, the mask was simply not there. What makes it more human still is what he did next. He did not sit down and dissolve. He gathered himself, and he went upstairs, and he woke 2 sleeping boys to tell them their mother was dead. Whatever broke in that hallway, he put it back together long enough to be their father first. The staff who describe the night describe a man moving between 2 impossible tasks, feeling everything and then, minutes later, allowing his sons to feel it while he held the walls up around them, and he kept holding them up for the week that followed, while the crowd swelled outside the London palaces and the flag over Buckingham Palace stayed conspicuously furled. The royal family remained behind the granite walls of Balmoral in near silence. The public read that stillness as coldness, as a family that could not be bothered to grieve in the open. But the staff inside describe a different scene entirely. A father keeping the television off, keeping the newspapers out of his son's hands, walking the 2 boys out onto the moors, into the wind and the heather, trying to give them a few ordinary hours before the world demanded a performance of grief from children. The institution's instinct that week was to hide. His instinct, the witnesses say, was to protect. Those are not the same thing, though from the outside they looked identical. The furled flag over the palace told the public one story. The man walking his sons across the hills told another. Only one of those stories reached the cameras. Now, Step back and look at both versions at once, because this is where it gets interesting. The official version is not a lie. There really was a prince who managed a crisis. He flew to Paris himself, against resistance from within his own institution, to bring Diana's body home. He stood beside her alone with the door closed for several minutes, and a member of the household later said he came out changed, quieter, older. He made the arrangements, he held the line. Everything the palace said about a man doing his duty was true, and the private version is also true. There really was a man who set a telephone down in a corridor and leaned against a wall and could not move. Both of those men existed in the same body on the same night. One of them the world was shown. The other one, the world was never meant to meet. If these accounts of the family behind the image are worth your time, subscribing costs nothing, and more stories like this one are already queued. The bell notification means you will actually see them when they arrive. Then stay with me, because the last part is the part that changes how you see the man. Because once you know about the corridor, everything that came after reads differently. Every composed appearance, every steady public face across the decades that followed. We tend to read that composure as coldness, as a man who never really felt the loss of the mother of his sons. But watch the sequence again. The break came first in the dark, unwitnessed, except by staff. The composure came after, which means the still face the public spent years criticizing was not the absence of grief. It was the management of it, a discipline built, brick by brick, over the one feeling he had already proven he could not fully control. That is the reframe, in present tense, because it still holds. The prince who managed a crisis and the man who leaned against a wall are not two different people telling two different stories. They are the same person, in the correct order. The wall came first. The management came after. For the rest of his life, he learned or relearned exactly how much composure that one loss would demand of him, and he paid it in public again and again for decades. Both versions are true. The distance between them is the whole story. That distance is where the real man lives, in the space between the face the crown required and the grief that got past it for a few minutes in a Scottish castle. Close the gap, and you lose him. You either get the tabloid caricature of the cold husband, or you get the palace portrait of the dutiful prince, and neither one is a person. The person is in the middle, in the corridor, with his hand on the wall. And here is the quiet vindication, the thing that only becomes visible with time. Look at the two boys he walked across the moors that week. He shielded them from the worst of it, when the institution's every reflex was to close ranks and say nothing. He kept the cameras and the headlines at arm's length long enough for them to be children losing a mother, rather than symbols performing a nation's grief. The palace kept that private father out of view. But he was the truer figure, the instinct to protect, not the instinct to hide. You can trace the line forward from those moors. Two grown men who have spoken, in their own ways and their own time, about the impossibility of grieving under a global gaze. Whatever else came between them and their father in the years after, the man who kept the television off and walked them into the wind was doing the one thing the training had never taught him. He was letting them feel it, he of all people who had been drilled since boyhood to file feeling away where no camera finds it, chose for his sons a few unguarded hours instead. That choice cost him. It looked from outside like a family that would not grieve. It was, in fact, a father there grieving in the only private way the crown had left him. So what does the corridor mean now, from here, knowing everything that followed? It means the funeral was never the real moment. The world thought it was. The world watched the procession and searched that composed face for a crack and found none, and drew its conclusions. But the true moment had already happened 6 days earlier, where no lens could reach it. The funeral was the performance, the corridor was the man, and we have spent all these years studying the wrong scene. It means, too, that composure is duty was not a slogan he recited. It was a sentence written into him so early and so deep that even a loss like this could only unmake it for a matter of minutes before the discipline closed back over the wound. Most people, given the worst news of their lives at 3 a.m, would take days to stand up straight. He took the length of a walk up a staircase. That is not coldness. That is a lifetime of training, doing precisely what it was built to do, holding a man together whether or not he wanted to be held together. And it means that the rest of his life, the decades of flawless public bearing that carried him all the way to the throne, can be read as one long act of concealment. Not concealment of indifference, concealment of the opposite. He spent the years that followed learning to hide the one grief he could not control, so completely that the world mistook the hiding for not having felt it at all. The mask got better precisely because the thing underneath it had once slipped, and he never intended to let it slip again. That is the cost the staff glimpsed that night, and the rest of us never saw the bill for. What it takes out of a man to feel something that large once in a corridor, and then to file it away and keep it filed for the rest of his life, to walk behind the coffin steady, to wear the still face at every anniversary, to become king with that particular silence sealed inside him. The training won. It almost always won. It won everywhere, except the one place and the one night that this story is about. So picture it one last time and then let it sit. The dim hallway at Balmoral, the hour past 3 a.m, the telephone receiver set back into its cradle without a single word, a hand pressed flat against the wall, and a man standing beside it, not moving, while the news he has just been given settles onto him with its full weight. No cameras, no statement, no mask. Only the staff who cleaned the rooms and carried the trays, standing very still in the dark, watching the one moment the training could not hold. That is the picture the palace never described. That is the man behind the king. And the question it leaves you with is not whether he grieved. He grieved. The question is what it costs a person to spend the rest of his life making sure you never saw it. The hand stays on the wall. The weight keeps landing, and the corridor holds it in silence, where it has been holding it ever since.